Is recording? Okay. Good morning and welcome to the forum at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Spencer Graves. I am a member of the forum committee. This forum is a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those which involve ethical values in the contemporary world, and promote critical thinking. It has been doing this since 1943. We will ask the speaker to present for about 35 minutes. Then we will pause to request donations, and that will be followed by a question and answer for roughly 20 minutes. This program is live streamed on YouTube where viewers can post questions in the chat, and George will monitor those questions and ask them of the speaker on your behalf. People in the room with me are asked to silence your cell phones, please. I found today's speaker, John Mueller, almost a year ago in searching for extraditing bin Laden. I'm a compulsive fact checker. I had not found anything in previous searches for this, but a literature search is never complete. This time I found a paper on the website of the Cato Institute. That paper did not cite sources, and I was reluctant to use it. Fortunately, I found a Wikipedia article on the author, John Mueller. From that, I learned that he is a prolific researcher, the Woody Hayes Chair of National Security Studies, and a professor of both political science and dance at Ohio State University. Most important from my perspective is that he had published a book a year earlier on the stupidity of war and the case for complacency. I felt the message of that book deserved to be heard on this forum. Fortunately, the rest of the forum committee agreed with me, and John agreed to speak. Most importantly, he will speak now on the stupidity of war and the exaggeration of threats. And I apologize, we're having video problems, but that's not going to be a problem when this is rebroadcast on KKFI. So, John?
Okay, thank you. You're seeing my slides, which have a picture of the book on it.
Yep.
Okay, well, I'd like to talk about a couple of things from the book. One is what I think is potentially the most important development in the history of human race, but gets very little attention. The decline of natural law. And you may disagree with that characterization, but I'll try to demonstrate that it has happened. And the other aspect will be basically the issue of risk perception, particularly by the United States, and bring it today with dealing with Ukraine, China. Okay, let me begin. The slide doesn't seem to be advancing.
Anamika, you may need to take over the slides.
Let me just talk about what the next slide would say. You can see it.
John,
Yes.
do you want to go back to the PowerPoint window where it's in PowerPoint form rather than Adobe?
Yeah.
Let me see where it is.
You might have closed it.
Press escape.
Okay, stop the share.
Now, why does the share screen again, right?
So do you have it up in the PowerPoint presentation?
No, because I have to get out and do a bunch of other stuff, it looks like.
So, Anamika, just present the slides yourself.
All right, John, you're going to have to tell me when to move forward.
Okay, wait.
Huh?
As much as I love you all, I don't want you all to know my login.
Right. You bet not.
Probably.
It's the CIA. They're right here.
Right. All right, John, can you say something for me again?
Yeah, I could tell you what the next slide is. The one after Stupidity of War, the next one. You got that?
Yeah, go to the next slide. There we go. Yes, you got it.
Okay.
So I saw I'm reading now, Paul Schroeder, 1985, etc. Brad DeLong,
Right.
2004. Okay.
Yeah. One of the most remarkable things that's happened since World War II is the way that Europe has slided into international peace, freedom from international war, for 75 years. Um, the and that's as Schrader pointed out in the 80s. That basically never happened before. You can go to the next slide. The Yeah, it also is from another historian, Evan Luard, a similar sort of thing. What's impressive is that Europe used to be the world's most warlike continent. Whole centuries would go by, and there was basically no, there's years, there wasn't an international war going on. It used to be that they do maybe 75 wars per year. Now they seem to be doing one war every 75 years, which is an improvement. And I don't think it's necessarily a change. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, this is what's also happened has been a decline of international war generally. And this chart lists the number of wars that have taken place in each year. And the black line across the bottom is the number of international wars. Essentially, in the last 30 years, there's been only a handful of international wars. One at the end of the very end of the last century, between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and then three wars, two of them by the United States against Afghanistan and Iraq, which would not have happened if 9/11 not taken place. And the other one is the one in Ukraine currently. So you can see that there's very little. This is not only a European phenomenon now, but it's basically the absence of war is, but it is pretty general. Okay, next slide. The way I deal with it in the book and other writings has been that there's been a remarkable to explain this phenomenon. There's been a remarkable change in the attitude toward wars over the last 100 years. This is from a prominent British historian who talks about before 1914, in other words, before World War One, it was an almost universal, considered acceptable, inevitable, and for many people desirable. And that's very much true. Can you give the next slide? If you look at the literature before World War One, it's incredibly easy to find people saying these things about war. It's redemptive, it's progressive, it's wonderful, it's glorious, it's sacred, etc. And about peace, they found it disgusting. If you go down to the bottom three of what they said about peace, I can't quite read it here, but one is by Emile Zola, about the peace is utter emptiness. Other people were saying things like, it's bovine content. My personal favorite. That's by a British historian. And death. Peace is associated with death. Well, it is true, of course, more people die during peace than during war, but it's not quite the same thing. And that was by a British art critic. Okay, next slide. Now, what happens is that after World War II, after World War One, rather. This is
Yeah, it's still talking. I can hear it.
Well, you can hear him through my.
Yeah. Hang on.
Okay, next slide. After the war, you can't find that at all. It looked really hard. I found maybe 2 people who said stuff like this after World War One. The next slide. Are you there?
The computer.
Yes, we're here. We're here, but we're having technical difficulties.
Okay. The next slide basically argues that. Effectively, what's happened is that after World War One, it's extremely easy to find the next slide. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
As Arnold Toynbee says, and 5 or 6 other people listed there's a major change in attitudes toward war. Now war was seen to be really stupid, essentially, and disgusting and horrible and everything else. And that's almost universal. As I said, I found maybe 2 people who said some of the old things in the past. One, a German general, another Mussolini. It's not a trivial exception. But essentially, with the forming of the League of Nations and so forth, there was an effort to try to get rid of war. The next slide. So then the question is, why didn't World War One have that impact? Well, it was a very destructive war, but there've been destructive wars forever. If you go back to perhaps the most famous war in history, the Trojan War, I keep reading at the end what happened to the Trojans after they lost the war. Answer: all the men were killed, and all the women and children sold into slavery. A piece of the women out in sexual slavery. The city was burned to the ground, and people couldn't even find where it had been until about the 19th century. So that sounds pretty, well, to me, pretty destructive. It was also stupid. World War One is certainly not the first stupid war, the feudal war or pointless war. And basically, the idea that it was peculiar would be unromantic is bizarre. I mean, dysentery was not invented in 1914. Mud was not invented in 1914. And bad food was not invented in 1914. There was a period of economic progress, quite remarkable, sometimes called the European miracle, for 100 years before 1914. But if that changed attitudes, it didn't do it very much because you still got all the things I talked about earlier. The thing that's unique about World War One, really unique, was the first war before which there was a really substantial organized anti-war movement. It was a gadfly movement, but it was there. People disparaged it, but the ideas were getting a certain amount of prominence. What seems to have happened with World War One was that after the war, people were seriously disparaged those ideas, said, no, war is really terrible. Let's do something about it. Let's get rid of it like we got rid of slavery 100 years before. Okay, that idea basically is permeated the world. Obviously, we've got a couple of things to worry about, though, in between that, namely Japan. Next slide, please. Japan had not been in World War II or World War One, and you could still find it in Japan. When I was talking about you couldn't find it, I couldn't find it in Europe or in the United States or Canada or in the West. You could still find it in Japan. Japan had another war in them, it turns out. And after that war, they pretty much agreed with what people have been saying in 1918. Next slide. The other big exception, obviously, was Adolf Hitler. And I can give you 20 statements like this by historians that Hitler was about the only European wanted war. He had been run over by a truck, it seems to me, Europe. So we can talk more about that if you want later. Okay, next slide. After World War II, the world slumped into this period of international peace, and it's really quite remarkable overall. John Gaddis points out it was really mystifying because he argues that who could have imagined that this would happen, have nuclear weapons pointing at each other and on the other side. It seems to me, and the book argues in some length, that World War III was never in the cards. Next slide, please. The Soviets, for example, had no plans to invade Western Europe. They did have a plan that was revolutionary in using violence, but they didn't have any plans to invade Western Europe. To deter them, attacking Western Europe was simply not necessary. Next slide. And here's somebody who's actually been in the archives, a guy named Mostny, and he argues too that the policy of deterrence was simply not necessary. The Soviets were willing to defend themselves. NATO, of course, was willing to defend itself, but neither side saw war as remotely in anybody's interest. And I think it basically was never in the cards. Okay, next slide. This is fortunately pretty much my last slide. The second to last slide. Okay, next, click again. At the same time, there are things that have happened which are war-like, but they're not international war. For example, intervening in other countries' civil wars, as happened in Yemen, in Syria. The COVID regime change, economic sanctions. There's been hundreds of border conflicts, but these border conflicts have almost never led to war. What has happened is that the people doing the conflicts shoot at each other and then quit. Furthermore, there increasingly, people who have studied it demonstrate, increasingly happen in places that are ungarrisoned and border areas that are ungarrisoned, unpopulated. Sometimes, though, there have been these border conflicts, so that still happens, but that's not the same as a war. There's been poaching of fish, but people have been poaching fish ever since fish and people were in whichever came second. The firing shots caused the bow and so forth. I can't read the last part of the slide again. There's sports of terrorism, a certain amount of assassination and so forth. So what we have had is these kinds of things, but they're basically all short of wars, trade wars and so forth. You can count them, you can be irritated by them, and they can also have tragic consequences, including people, such as intervening in civil wars and economic sanctions. Substantially these wars. Okay, next and last slide. Can you read that? I can't see it on the screen.
The decline of international wars, perhaps the greatest political.
Next slide.
Okay.
Okay. Now let me conclude by talking about whether the long peace has been. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Go back to the slide before this. Can you do that? I have this quote here. This is from an Israeli intellectual, very prominent one, who argues two things that I've been arguing. Namely, this decline of international war is one of the most remarkable things in human history. He also argues that it's come from a change of attitude, which I agree with. However, he's writing just before the Ukraine war. And what he's arguing at that time is that maybe this will upset it if Putin actually does invade. And of course, Putin did. Okay, now the next slide. And it seems to me, I've got a couple of op-eds on this. I can be glad to send them on if you're interested. It seems to me that the war in Ukraine is potentially, at least, not a change. In other words, you don't find a whole bunch of people saying, hey, Putin invaded Ukraine, now we can invade anybody we want. Rather, it seems to be an example of the stupidity of war. Whatever Putin wanted in this war, sort of look through everything Putin said and everything everybody else said about why he wanted the war. And within a few weeks, he had failed at all of them. One of the most prominent things was he was trying to keep Ukraine from moving substantially to the west. Obviously now, what's happened in Ukraine is that Ukraine will never be, it will always be now probably basically a Western country. He wanted to preserve the Russian language within Ukraine because of the invasion. Now everybody wants to speak Ukrainian, including those who are normally Russian speakers. If he designed the war to show the prowess of the Russian military, it obviously has been a massive fiasco. If he wanted to destroy democracy, that's failed. If he wanted to establish control over Ukraine and other places nearby, that's obviously failed abysmally. If he wanted as some people say, he wanted to cause discontent and dissension within NATO, precisely the opposite has happened. So if there's ever been a failed war, it failed from the get-go, basically. That would be certainly one. So I don't think it's likely to be a game changer. It's likely to be an aberration. We'll have to see, and we may know more in a few months or over the course of this calendar year. We'll see. The other issue is about China. I've done quite a bit of work on the China issue, and I'm glad to talk about it more if you want. But it just seems to me that China, like the Soviet Union after World War II, was not a threat in the sense that it wanted to start wars. It has said for 75 years that it wants to take over Taiwan, but that has remained basically declaratory. It has certainly advanced economically and has built up its military, and it's taken over, sort of arrogantly taken over some of the claimed various things in South China Sea. It's also gone increasingly totalitarian domestically, but I don't think it basically presents a threat. Right now, it's very politically wise to bash China, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Of course, they're doing it. I think that's singularly unwise. Overall, it seems to me, just published an op-ed a few months ago, what you might look at is the decline of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union declined not because of anything the West did, but because of its own internal contradictions and falling apart and societal malaise in various ways, and just sort of crumbled from within. And if China faces that as a possibility, as I don't know, I'm not thinking it's going to collapse, but under Xi, it's become incredibly anti growth, essentially. He's continued to trend big time, in which the party controls the economy, and whereas he should be liberalizing the economy, he's doing the exact opposite. So I think mostly you don't have to contain him. You don't have to do much of anything. Just let him do it. Napoleon once had a phrase saying, "Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake." Now, I don't think China's really that much of an enemy. Maybe for this one, we'd say, never interrupt your competitor when it's making a mistake. I think it's making a very big mistake. That doesn't mean it's going to collapse. I think it's likely to stagnate, certainly not economically. I'm certainly not alone in that. Okay, I think I've run over a little bit of time on this, so let me stop and ask for questions of outrage, anything else. Thank you.
Okay, well, before we go to the questions,
If you're talking, I can't hear you.
Before we go to the questions, you can hear me now, John? Well, they can hear me in the room. Where's Anamika? In any case, we need to circulate to get the collection here, so please, we need to cover the cost of this facility and the staff time needed to support these programs. Your donation keeps the forum streaming to each week to help. The key thing is not that you're experiencing this presentation yourself, but you're helping to make it available to others. All right. Contributions can be mailed to All Souls or made electronically. I'm told that instructions for how to donate online should appear in the chat for those who are following us on YouTube. Checks can be mailed to All Souls UU Church at 4501 Walnut Street, Kansas City, Missouri.
So still not hearing anything. If you want to continue this over the phone or anything, my number you already have, 614 4.
In any case, please mention the form in the memo line of a check, if okay. And So can you hear me now, John?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, good. So please, if you have a question, please come up over here, and get in line over here to my left, I guess, and come to the microphone to ask your questions. Speak clearly into the microphone. One question per person until everyone has had an opportunity to ask a question. And please, no speeches so that we can make better use of the time of our speaker.
Could you please talk a little bit about the internal political situation in Russia relating to Putin, and what are the chances in the next year that someone will come to their senses and have this war cease?
I think they're fairly good. Let me know if you can hear me. So because it's really yesterday we had a big power.
Yes, we can hear you.
All over on some wires and stuff. So that maybe is causing some of the communications problems today, even though the power is back. I'm not really sure what's going to happen next. Russia has basically been doing this offensive, that's all, and it's now seems to be petering out. The Ukrainians are gearing up to do their offensive, spring offensive. At that point, it may be possible for negotiations to begin. I'm not certain about that. There is discontent within, as you suggest, within Russia, both from the people of Fox and the Dippers, I must say. And it's possible someone will try to dethrone Putin, but he does seem to be in quite a strong position politically. As he got the police and the army at his back, he probably can hang in there for quite some time. There's been rumors about it that he may be ill with cancer, but I don't know if that's true or not. The rumors keep coming and going. I think the most likely thing is that he has talked about having negotiations. And after the spring offensive, maybe those will begin. It might take a long time, but it might start with a ceasefire, which would be better than a war. But right now, it does not look very good at all.
Hi. Are you at all concerned that stupid politicians who want to inject Lysol to cure diseases might lead to more stupid wars?
Um, I think it has in the case of the Ukraine. And literally, I did not think Putin was going to invade because I didn't think he was that stupid. Even if it had been sort of successful with his invasion, which he was not, they'd still have to occupy the biggest country in Europe, besides Russia itself, with an extremely resentful population. You could have known from what happened in the aftermath of 2014. I am worried that stupid politicians could still stumble into it. And I guess that's what we're waiting for. But I want to point out that we've had stupid politicians for a long time. Certainly starting in 1945. And these stupid politicians have not gone to war with each other directly in major wars. It's something that's completely unprecedented historically. So I think they, in general, Biden's policy is supported, which is to support the Ukrainians, more or less of the way he supported the Afghans after the Soviet invasion in the late 70s, late in the 80s, late 70s, we're not getting into it directly, and eventually the war comes to an end. Sort of known as proxy wars, and I think that'll probably continue. But you don't really see anywhere in the world, this is not, like Latin America, anyplace else, countries saying, let's go to war with each other. If they do, people will say, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And they're saying, oh, yeah, I guess it is stupid. Let's not do it. But I think we're in fairly good shape. But I do think it's worrisome that you could get somebody who could be extremely risk acceptant and try something. Again, Putin's shattering of this was limited. He didn't attack Western Europe. All he did was attack Ukraine, apparently under the assumption that he could win very quickly and easily. Now that that didn't happen, he's got to figure out a way out of this. But even Putin's thing, which I think was very stupid, is actually is not going to make. I think it's not going to start a new trend. If people, including with the Chinese, if they look at it and say, "Well, we could take over Taiwan, I guess, right? Then what? We get what it's getting, and hostility throughout the world, and also extraordinary economic consequences as people stop trying to trade with us. That certainly happened with Russia. It'd be more difficult, but it would happen also with China. Even in that case, and I don't think they're gearing up to do it anyway. So I'm reasonably content about that, but the Putin stupid war is certainly putting the proposition to a test. I'll tell you that later.
As a non-rich human being, I'm wondering about the peace dividend that we're expecting any time now for the last, I don't know, 30 years, 40 years. And how is it that we can wrest that away from our oligarchs?
Well, that's a complicated question. In Mexico, I think the country has been growing, and people have been getting richer, rich and poor. The rich have been getting richer faster than the poor have gotten richer. But generally speaking, since World War II, the world has experienced an astounding improvement. Before COVID, say 2018, there are maybe a dozen countries in the whole world out of 180 that in the past had been better off in terms of human, material well-being. Just a dozen. The other 170 or something were definitely better off than they'd ever been before. And that includes both China and Russia at the time. COVID may have changed that a little bit and caused some countries to retreat some. But if you take 2017, 2018, 2019, the proposition holds. We have had an enormous amount of economic growth, where countries have doubled, tripled, quadrupled their income per capita. And a lot of that has been due to the fact that they've had a stable economic situation internationally, which previously had been disrupted frequently by wars. So one of the benefits of not having wars is that it enhances international trade, which generally is good for everybody. What happens is that they're looking out, and they say, well, we used to go to war with that country all the time. But we're not doing it anymore. Maybe they got something we want to buy, or something we can sell them something. To give the most spectacular example of this would be Germany and France. Germany and France are filled with incredibly clever people. And centuries they use this cleverness to figure out how to get into wars with each other. We succeeded brilliantly year after year, century after century, decade after decade. Since 1914, since 1945, that hasn't happened at all. It would be interesting to see if you can find any Frenchman or anybody in Germany saying the following. We used to get into wars with the other country every 20 years or so, and we had to renew that again. Basically, they'd be thrown in the loony bin. You might find some people in insane asylums who say that, but the reason they're in the insane asylum is because they've been saying stupid things like that. So what you got is these two hostile countries that sometimes are not so hostile, but sometimes so hostile, and they obviously got into wars a lot. Have lived side by side. They're very big. They're very important, and they've grown enormously from this, benefited enormously, and they've even gone into an economic union with each other, of course. So that's fairly typical. That's an extreme case, but typicality, you might say. But in general, things have really improved a lot in terms of human welfare since World War II.
Good morning. I have a different sort of question. Is there any real basis for grassroots drive? I didn't phrase that right. Is there any real drive to reduce funding to the Ukraine war, or is it just a bunch of right-lying Republicans driving it? And there is a
Yeah,
plan here.
well, I think that there are people who want to think about that seriously. And you know, say the Trump camp, of course. Um, but I think it's very unlikely to be successful. There might be some moderation. There might be some more careful. It's not unreasonable to demand that there be more scrutiny about where the money is going. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, at least was before this war. And the fact that people may be stealing some of the stuff we should be careful about that. But I don't think there's the cost of the war can be continued and to be paid, I think, for quite some time. And I think politicians, serious politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, think that. One of the things that's really, really remarkable about this war and what's happening now. Friedman in the New York Times about a year ago went to Davos, this international meeting in Switzerland, and asked about the Ukrainian war. He said the Russians didn't invade Ukraine; they invaded Europe. And so what you got is this extraordinary coming together of Western European countries and to doing something which is incredibly difficult, which is to cut themselves off from Russian energy supplies, which they're moving on extraordinarily well, even though it's really quite painful. And I think they've been very much willing to bear the cost of that. And so I don't see any real, you know, you can feel some grumbling and so forth. But it seems to me that at the present levels that the Ukrainians need, I suspect that both Europeans and North Americans will be able to continue it on. And I think I don't think that's likely to change. Certainly under Biden and probably even under Biden's successor.
So my question is looking ahead, several other factors that are potentially a part of whether we have a major war or not, world or whatever ethnocentric maybe term for it is, or I mean Eurocentric anyway. The technology, what role has that had? Will it had? And I think of technology of destruction and technology of communication. And then the other factor that's really big is the climate change and how that's going to change international relations.
Yeah, I'm not a technologist. I think nuclear weapons, for example, haven't made all that much difference. If nuclear weapons evaporated, I don't think there would have been World War III in Europe or any place else overall. Um, Certainly, the ability to kill people has improved a lot, and also more precisely. But it was awfully good before that. And anyway, being killed by a bullet may be better than being hacked to death by, you know, the berserker in the Vikings or something. So and third thing about that, I don't think we need any further technological change. And I don't think the technology has been the heart of it. I think the heart of it was, as I indicated earlier, people coming together and saying things like, let's not do this anymore. I know we've been doing it for thousands of years, ever since the dawn of the human race, but it's stupid. Let's not do it. 150 years ago before that, he had said the same thing about slavery. And a lot of people were saying, what do you mean slavery? You know, slavery's in the Bible. Slavery's everywhere. There's been slavery everywhere. One of the great master institutions of the human race. And the people were saying, I don't care. Of course, that's true. But I don't want to do it anymore. It's immoral. It's unjust, whatever. Over 100 years, at considerable cost, economic cost, slavery was eliminated from what was then known as Christendom, the leading countries of the world. The last country in that was Brazil. It was extremely costly for them to get rid of slavery. Slavery was very beneficial overall to the economy, I guess, overall. They paid the price anyway. So I think that's probably going to happen. Global warming is another thing. Obviously, war is not a good thing for global warming. It is a good thing for global warming, I guess you could say. Climate change thing, I think, really requires countries to come together and change policies, change technology, move more to other sources of power. And in that case, I think technology may be something of the beneficial. Those two things. One is potentially nuclear power, and certainly with fusion nuclear power, you could introduce a large amount of power without having to do much in the way of climate change vapor ejecting promulgation. And it also makes people capable of surviving when the weather gets really bad. It used to be that a lot of people died because of heat. And now we have air conditioning. The number of people who have been saved by air conditioning is very high. And what you really want is economic development so that poor countries can afford to handle extremes of weather, both whether it's the cold or the warm end. And I think so. I think economic development, which is almost certain to happen, maybe slower than we hope, than we think, but nonetheless, I think that's generally going to help in that area as well. The absence of war, international war in particular, is going to be certainly an important element in facilitating this development and facilitating that process.
Several commentators have made the case that to serve that the restoration, economic and with respect to sovereignty of Ukraine cannot happen unless Crimea is fully restored to Ukraine. Ben Hodges makes the case that we won't have peace in that part of the world, and Ukraine will never be restored economically unless the Russians are required, as a condition to ending the war, to leave Crimea. Would you comment?
Yeah, and I don't particularly agree with that. Crimea, by the way, was a net economic drain on Kyiv, as with the Donbass. There's more money spent subsidizing Crimea and Donbass than they're paying in taxes, for example. I think the Crimean thing, you're absolutely right. The Crimean thing is a big issue, big problem. And I suspect what's going to happen if there is negotiations would be the Russians would be able to keep it, while withdrawing in some sense or other from the rest of Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians would buy that. Before the war, there were various peace proposals from the Ukrainian government. This is, of course, before the war, but they involved coming to some settlement on Donbass, and then to Crimea. What the Ukrainian authorities were proposing before the war was that they demanded that be talked about for the next 30 years. That was their demand. Not that the Russians had to get out of Crimea. The problem with Crimea is there's a lot of people there who want to be in Russia, I think. It's very much it was not part of Crimea. It was not part of Ukraine until 1994 anyway. But that remains the biggest single issue. More tangible and possible would be to work out a deal where the Russians gradually withdraw from the areas they've occupied in southern Ukraine, not including Crimea, and then worrying about Crimea later, which is what they were proposing before the war. But they demand Crimea, which has, among other things, Sevastopol, the base for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, that goes back to Ukraine. I think that's going to be a real problem for the Russians, any Russian, not only, but anybody who succeeds them, the hawk or dove or left or right, to accept. It is a bargaining chip and say, okay, you get out of Ukraine, southern Ukraine. We'll let you stay in Crimea, but we want to keep talking about it. And I think the Russians might buy that. If they stick to it, I think it's going to be a long war.
We have a YouTube question from Craig LeBeau, and he's asking how can we minimize the risk that China will invade Taiwan?
I think probably the best is to get the Taiwanese so they can defend themselves the way the Ukrainians have remarkably well in Ukraine after 2014 when took over Crimea and so forth, and more or less took charge in parts of in the Donbass region in Ukraine. The United States and other countries were very helpful at beefing up the Ukrainian army, and everybody's surprised by how well it did. And they were wary because Ukrainian intelligence was infiltrated by Russian spies. And so they're very wary about doing that and being careful about it because they thought that information and other stuff is going to Ukraine might actually go to Russia. But once the war started, and the Ukrainians really did fight and fight incredibly well, that concern obviously has been diminished. There's also been an effort to get rid of the Russian moles within Ukraine. So I think that it's going to be a pretty good. In the case of Taiwan, that would be the logical thing. I think that makes, in other words, supporting the Taiwanese. The problem in some respects is the Taiwanese are much more sanguine about the possibility of war. They don't really think, overall, they're still not all that convinced it's going to happen. And maybe they're right. I think they probably are right. So they don't want to necessarily go into extra training. But if the Chinese do attack, it seems to me the most likely thing would not be a war leading to a war between China and the United States, but rather something like Ukraine, in which Ukraine would be supplied by the United States and other Western countries various ways. That's more difficult in one sense because they have to do it by sea. In the case of Ukraine, we've got a lot of supplies and stuff going to Poland, and they just go across the border into Ukraine. Very easy. So it's more difficult in that sense. But it's also because it's an island, Taiwan is, the Russian and the Chinese would have a big difficulty in supporting themselves there against a hostile insurgency. They've got 80 miles of ocean between them and Ukraine. And if that's going to take continuous supplying and the danger of a lot of Russian soldiers, Chinese soldiers dying in some sort of urban warfare or guerrilla warfare conducted by the Taiwanese. Also, that kind of warfare doesn't take very many people. It doesn't take thousands. It takes hundreds or maybe thousands of dedicated insurgents. And if I were the Chinese, I'd be worried about that a lot, and I think they are.
You made the statement that the Soviet Union collapsed on its own, not as a result of actions by forces outside the Soviet Union. However, since the early 1950s, possibly even late 1940s, the U.S. policy was to spend heavily on the military, causing a response of spending about an equal amount of money, which on an economy half the size of the U.S. was a much greater strain. Are you saying that the economic strain from the trying to respond and match the U.S. spending on military had no effect on the Soviet Union and its collapse? And was there any effect?
Yeah, it definitely had some, but the whole situation was disastrous from a Russian standpoint. The economy wasn't working; it was stagnating. They were very much overspending on defense. You're right about that. But even without that, they were in big trouble. Then one of the policies that the United States adopted was containment. Well, after 1975, after the defeat in Vietnam, 10 countries moved into the Soviet orbit. Each of those countries became, as they called it at the time, each country became economic, political, and often military basket cases and looked to the Soviet Union for warmth and sustenance. And fairly soon, the Soviet Union became convinced that maybe it would have been better off if it had been contained. So in many respects, they were given they're given rope. And they basically did, the statement I said was in a paper I got, and it's a statement from when at the collapse time by Strobe Talbot, who's a very good Soviet watcher. And his argument is basically it just simply wasn't working. The thing was collapsing around itself. I do think you're right that the impetus to try to outdo the United States, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the ridiculous amount of expenditure, particularly on nuclear weapons, it helped to exacerbate that. But I think it pretty much was happening anyway. Which is what Stroke Talbot talks about. So without it, I think they would have been somewhat better off, but not a lot better off because the system was rotten to the core, in which people were working but not working. Let me give you one example from a friend of mine who was there. He grew up there, and he was going to go to college, and his parents wanted to take a job first, over the summer. We didn't want to really stay home and play football, soccer. Anyway, they get him a job at a power plant. He goes into the power plant on the day, very grudgingly, about 7 o'clock in the morning, and no one's there. About 9 o'clock, the employees supposedly come in 2 hours late, and they say, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, it says on thing I'm supposed to start at 7 o'clock in the morning." And they said, "If you ever do that again, we're going to beat you up, making us look bad." So his work day was they'd work for a couple hours in the morning, then they'd go to lunch, then they'd go to a movie, and then they'd come back and do another hour or two of work. So they did do something. The whole economy was like that. There was no incentive to innovate. Everybody just started putting in their time, and it was just basically disintegrating overall. They mostly brought it on themselves. The comparison with China is somewhat similar, though I don't think it's not sure it's going to collapse. But they are moving into a period of stagnation in which the government takes control of the economy increasingly. Xi has put together proposals, not proposals, but put together edicts in which anything that's done in the private sector, any private companies have to have party members in the board of governors doing things that are risky. In other words, he's going to let these party hacks decide what's risky, not the capitalists in the company. They've also cut down enormously on free speech. You'd be thrown in jail for life for starting a quarrel. It's against the law. If you start a quarrel, they can throw you in jail forever. So it just seems to me that it's going to stagnate. If you're a state-run company, you can get loans, but if you're a private company, you have much more difficulty. The private sector is probably 7 times more efficient than the state-owned enterprise, the SOEs. And the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, are being given very much preferential treatment. They have in the past, but it's gotten much worse. So basically, it seems to me Xi's doing everything wrong. Again, the economy is very big. It's very important. It has a lot of, produces a lot of goods. It's not necessarily good for us if it collapsed, but it's going to be increasingly under strain. One thing that might be good from the Chinese standpoint, Xi seems to be willing to undo mistakes. One of his big mistakes was his COVID policy. And virtually overnight, he undid it. There are other cases as well. Something like imprisoning the Uyghurs. He gave that up overnight. So he does seem to be capable of seeing mistakes and changing them. And I think a possibility will be, and what has caused so much consternation is what is often called wolf warrior diplomacy, in which China, over particularly the last 10 years, and particularly under Xi, has tried to do a lot to sort of swing its weight in the world. And this has been wildly counterproductive. Country after country, the opinion toward China has gone down. I mean, important countries to it, like India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, and the United States. And I think it's possible, and I think there are signs of it, that Xi was beginning to see that kind of sashaying around and swinging your weight and really bullying behavior, it's a bad idea. If he continues with that, balloons or not, I think it may be that a relationship between China and the rest of the world will gradually improve. I certainly hope so.
Sterling Seagrave wrote the history of China for a while and discussed the topic of Taiwan when Chiang Kai-shek and the Song family took all the gold and all the armaments of China to Taiwan at the time, and then left them with all this debt to the point where Mao Zedong could not really feasibly invade them and take over Taiwan at the time. With that history in place, do you see the likelihood of a transition in Taiwan be much more like similar to the transition in Hong Kong, and that the war might not necessarily be fought anything more than economic takeover, and that the world supply of chips and technology would then not be affected greatly because of China's technology advancements since then?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that I think you're getting to the point where things could, that's the most plausible scenario. What happened in Hong Kong was that there was a lot of protests in 2019 and particularly 2020 over these laws. Eventually, grudgingly, the Chinese withdrew the new laws, which would have made Taiwanese susceptible to the incredibly corrupt courts that are in China, as opposed to its own courts, which aren't corrupt. Then what happened was that the anti-China movement was moving. The protesters were fewer in number, but they closed down the airport. They also took over the Parliament building and graffitiized it. It's somewhat similar to what happened, except worse, what happened in January 6th in the country. And they seemed to be moving toward pulling out of China. And it was at that point that Xi basically decided we can't let this happen. I see the handwritings on the wall, and we can't let it happen. And the danger would be that would happen in Taiwan. That Taiwan would, instead of keeping what seemed a perfectly legitimate, perfectly reasonable thing, we're independent, but we pretend we're not. We genuflect to the Chinese every once in a while. Meanwhile, we're getting richer and richer. Taiwan is far more rich in per capita income, per capita GDP, than is mainland China. And we'll keep making our chips and everything. It seems to me that there's be a lot of pressure, including from the United States, I think, to have them just simply continue that. And I think playing this charade, this game, this comic opera thing about Taiwan is independent, but it really isn't independent, or it is really not independent, but actually it is. And we'll keep doing that for decades if necessary. It is overall the best solution. But the danger would be that you'd have, like in Hong Kong, extremists moving toward what looks to be secession from China, and that would cross a major red line within not only Xi, but throughout the whole population of the mainland, or much of it at any rate. And they would be sort of forced, in their view, with that sort of happened in Hong Kong. So that's something very much to keep one's eye on, it seems to me. That is a major danger. The whole point you mentioned about it's just an economic thing. If they did take over Taiwan, it would be an economic nightmare from the standpoint of obviously Taiwan, but even from the standpoint of China. And if the Taiwanese simply gave up, the Ukrainians were supposed to do when Putin arrived, then maybe it would work. But if there's urban warfare, if there's hostility, if the Japanese, the Chinese occupying soldiers The Chinese government and the Chinese military, by the way, is as corrupt as anything else in China. They keep getting hit by snipers and by improvised explosive devices. It could be a very long, horrible occupation for the Chinese, even though they vastly outnumber the defenders.
Okay, it's after 10:30, but because of the technical glitches, we're going to continue to 10:35, and we have another question coming right up. Thank you, John.
I'm wondering, as I look at this philosophically, and as if I were an oligarch that had a lot of money, I'm wondering what kind of correlation might there be between the intense elevation of interest and time and money given to sports worldwide has on the decrease in international wars because of the competition people thrive on in sports.
Well, I'm not sure. That's really interesting to research somewhere. Obviously, the Olympics have become extremely important. In some respects, the Olympics have become important in the sense that they generate prestige. They give a really good Olympics and people think nice of you. So they've also had that effect, as well as the competitive one. The issue with China, frequently, it's the argument is they're a pure competitor. Well, my attitude is, yeah, so what? What's wrong with that? You've got a country that is very strong economically. It should be pointed out that China is number 2, perhaps, in GDP, but it's number 79th in GDP per capita. It's not a rich country. You could even, depending on your definition, you could even argue it's not even a developed country by that standard. I mean, Luxembourg would be quite the reverse. Not a very big GDP, but each person gets an awful lot of money. At any rate, but they are competing at various levels. And it seems to me, so what's the problem? Compete. Competition is a good thing. Read Adam Smith, talk to any economist. If they want to compete in TikTok, if they want to compete in other things, in chip manufacturing, let them compete. The other thing that China really wants, and this is something that should be given more thought, they really want prestige. They want people to pay attention to them. But in my view, what's wrong with that? People should pay attention to China. It's a big country. It's an important country. It's now the biggest trading partner for most countries in the world. That's really impressive. So if you genuflect for them from time to time, treat them seriously, it seems to me that's not a bad thing. For example, to give you an example, one of the things, Afghanistan is a nightmare, of course, but there's no way of getting rid of the Taliban, it looks like. But one thing would be to try to get Afghanistan so it becomes a normal, quiet, really boring country like it used to be. And a lot of countries around there have that as they like an idea. That includes not only the United States, but also Pakistan, also China, also Russia, also Iran. So they have a joint interest in trying to work together to solve the Afghan problem, or at least make it go away so it's not so problematic. And it seems to me that things like that could be done. The Chinese are worried about the South China Sea because, in part, because it's so important to them economically. And that's why they want to fortify it so they can deal with it rather than leaving policing of it up to the American Navy. Well, that's not an unreasonable demand. Maybe we can work that out as well. So both competition and cooperation, and obviously in the areas of global warming, big time, cooperation are called for and are distinctly possible, it seems to me.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Mueller. Just a reminder, each week's program is broadcast on KKFI at noon on Thursdays, typically 11 days later. This session with Professor Mueller will should air April 6th at noon Central at 90.1 FM or kkfi.org and click listen. John, would you please send me the op-eds you mentioned, and I will add them to the description of this episode of All Souls Forum on kkfi.org.
Glad to do it, sir.
And,
Technology clip.
and if you want to share this with others, invite them to search for All Souls Church YouTube channel at allsoulskc.org, or after the broadcast on April 6th, they can go to kkfi.org, then News and Public Affairs, then All Souls Forum, then the Stupidity of War and Exaggeration of Threats. Next week, the forum will feature Quentin Lucas, mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, discussing the state of the city. And services and the audience here is invited to services in the Bragg Auditorium at 10:45. What? Oh, the forum next week will be in the Bragg Auditorium. Thank you very much. Okay, and that concludes the program. Thanks again, John.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the great question.
Okay. Dynamite.